command lines have a feature where you can just press the up arrow to get back to previous queries. Usually a command line will give you some way of doing that, even if you might have to configure something sometimes to get it to work. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I'm going to actually drop this table, in other words delete it. I'm going to say drop table users, and let's just check, let's do double check, let's do show tables, and we can see that the users table is now gone. So obviously you have to be careful with this query. And I'm going to say create table users, so we're going to recreate it. And I'm going to create it with two columns. I'm going to say ID, that's going to be the name of the first column, and I'm going to make it an int. And an int is a numerical value in MySQL. It can store integers, so not floating point numbers, with a decimal point in them, just integer values. And we'll put a comma in and make the second column now username text. So now we've got two columns, ID and username. So in this statement here, where you specify the columns of the table, you can provide a comma separated list with, there can be lots of columns in there to add multiple columns to your table. Let's execute this. And where are we? In fact, I selected that and executed it, which only executes part of it, but I want the whole thing, so I'll deselect there, run it again, and yes, it's run fine now. And let's do a desk users. So there we've got two values. They are both allowed to be null at this point, and we're going to look at that a bit more shortly. Let's just insert some data in there. So this, you can probably guess how this works. In fact, if you want to pause the recording, pause the video, and have a go at it yourself, you can probably figure it out. But let's try it. Let's say insert into users, ID, username, values, and we'll put in, let's put in 1 for the ID, and the text goes in quotes. The text values have to be in quotes, and let's say username Bob. So once again, we can just replace where we previously had a single column, we can replace it with a comma separated list. We'll run that, and let's put another one in if it ran okay, which I see that it did. Let's put Vicky in, run that, and now let's do select star from users. So we've got Bob and Vicky. So that's it for this tutorial. Do have a go at that yourself. You can even create tables with multiple columns. You can have multiple text columns, multiple integer columns, whatever you like. And one thing probably that's worth mentioning already at this point is if you search in Google or your favorite search engine for MySQL types, you can find a list of the different data types that you can use. We've seen int and text so far, but there's a lot of different types here. If we go to numeric types, for instance, and then we go to integer types, we can see that an int, it can store integers between these two big values. But sometimes you want a smaller integer value. It's better to use a smaller one if you know you're only going to store small values of integers, because that takes up less space in your database. So you might use small int, tiny int, or conversely, if you need a really massive integer in there, you might want to use big int. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Have a go at that, because we're going to build on it in the next tutorial. So until next time, happy coding. Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at null in MySQL. That's N-U-L-L, null. So null is a special value that means that a field in your table doesn't have any value. If we look at the table we've got now, the users table, if we do a desk on it, desk users, we see it has two columns, and we see in the results grid here that they are both allowed to be null. And that's because we created them in the default way, which would allow them normally to be null. So we can do the following. For example, we can say, let's actually just bring up a query that I already ran here. So let's insert a row into the table. I'll give it an ID of 2, but for the username I'll specify null, and that means that for the username there's not going to be any value for this row. So I'm going to insert that, and yes, it went okay, we can see down here, and I'll do a select and run that. So now we can see we've got a row with the ID of 2, but I set the username to null. It has no value. We can do the same thing with the other column as well, because that's also allowed to be null. And we could even, if we wanted, make them both null, like this. And now if we do a select star from users, we see we've got a row with 2 null values in it. Now, often you don't want that. Often what you want is to specify that a particular value in a particular field, it can't be null. So you want to say that all the values in a certain column can't be null. So we'll look at how to do this. But first, let's just let's try something a little bit different. So I'm gonna do another insert into this table. Let's try this. And this time, in my fields list here, the list of columns, I'm only going to specify one column. So I'm going to delete username just as a random choice. And I'm going to specify the value 3 for that column so we can easily see which column it is. So here I'm doing an insert where we're only inserting a value for one particular column. And if I run this and then I do a select star from users, what we see is that we've inserted a row with the ID equal to 3, but again we've got null for the username. So you don't have to specify all the columns when you do an insert. If you've got columns that are allowed to be null, which they are if you create them in a default way, you don't have to specify those columns when you do an insert, and then the value will be null. It will have no value for the row that you inserted. Sometimes we want to, as I say, we want to say that values in a column can't be null. This is really common. It's probably the most frequent case because often we don't want data with sort of missing values in our database. Let's drop this table. Let's say drop table users. So that's going to delete the table and the table should be gone. We can check with show tables if we like. And we see there's no tables in this database. And let's recreate it. So I'm going to say create table users. Let's say ID, we'll just use the same as before. ID is going to be an int, and let's make a username field, which is going to be text, a username column, I should say. So if we create the table like this, both of the columns are allowed to be null, but we can put not null after any column to say that it can't be null. So you can do that on any of the columns that you want to not be null. Let's try it with both of them. I think we'll make both of the columns not null, and then if we do a desk users, we see that now they're not allowed to be null. So now if I try doing stuff like, let's bring up an insert here. Let's try. Well, we'll try this. Let's just run this. This is going to give an error. We can't insert null values for either of these columns now, even if I specify an ID, because I said also username not null when I created the table. This went wrong because even the username by itself can't be null. So again, we get an error down here. Now it's interesting to see what happens if you insert if you try to insert a row in a table with fields that are not allowed to be null, but then you don't mention those names in your insert. So let's try it. I will try getting rid of username here, and I'll try to insert a row with the ID of 9. Now if I run this on this particular version of MySQL, configured the way it is, what I find is that I get a warning icon down here. And if I do now so it's not an error that SQL has run, it's just giving me a warning. If I do select star from users, we see that what's happened is we did insert the row. The username appears to be blank. So the username is not null. It does have a value, but this value is actually a blank string. That's the default value for a text type. I'm calling it a string because this is kind of a technical lingo for some characters, a piece of text. We call it a string. So the default value for a text type is a blank string, a string of 0 length, which is not the same as null. If you try this on your database, you might find that you get different results, and we're going to talk about that a bit in the next tutorial. Let's just try this again. So this time what I'll do is I will try missing out the ID in the field list and just specify username, which I'll set to someone. I don't know, can't think of a name. Let's just run this. So now again we've got a warning icon down there at the bottom in the output pane, and if we try doing a select, now we see that we've inserted a value, we've inserted a row where the username is someone as I specified, and again ID has the default value for its type, and since ID is an int, the default value for an int is 0. Now this behavior, you might get different behavior with your version of MySQL, or it might be just that if someone else installed it especially, or if the MySQL developers decide to change the default options, you might find that you can't do this, that it won't let you not specify a value in an insert when the value is, we've said it's not null when we create a table. And we're going to look in the next tutorial at some configuration options that affect this. So to practice this, certainly give this a go. Try creating a table with 2 or more columns and make some or even all of them not null. And then try doing inserts in there. Try explicitly inserting null values, as I did near the beginning of the tutorial. And try also just missing those fields out of your field list in your insert statement. Miss them out. So try to insert a row where you're only specifying values for certain columns, and see what results you get with not null fields. Does MySQL insert a default value for a field that you haven't specified a value for, or does it do something else? Does it throw an error? Do have a go at that, and then in the next tutorial we'll look at some config options. So until next time, happy coding. Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial we're going to take a look at MySQL database engines. So although this is not a tutorial on MySQL database administration, it is a tutorial on using MySQL as an end user, and on learning SQL and working with a MySQL database. Nevertheless, there are some configuration options that affect how MySQL works. So before we go any further, we're going to have to take a look at some configuration related stuff, because you're going to need to know that in order to predict how your queries are actually going to work. So I've already typed use tutorial 1, but there's no harm in typing it again. So we're using the right database. And now I'm going to type show engines and execute that. Now, what a MySQL engine is it's a module, a part of MySQL that deals with your SQL and constructs tables, basically. I'm not sure if the actual code that parses your query is part of the engine, but certainly the part of MySQL that constructs tables and decides what they can do and what they can't do, that's called an engine. And MySQL supports various different engines. Now, most of these I haven't used, but there are 2 really important ones that you should know about. Historically, MySQL, as I remember it, this is according to my memory, and I've been working with MySQL probably since around 1999, I think. Historically, MySQL was built around, and I don't know how to pronounce these names, but I'll make up a pronunciation. It was built around this MyISAM engine. Now, it was a good start, but it didn't support some really important features of databases. It didn't support, as I remember it didn't support transactions, and I presume still doesn't. It didn't support foreign keys even, which, as we'll see later on, are really important to use. So it was a big step forward later on when MySQL came out with this InnoDB engine, which does support transactions, does support foreign keys. And if you do show engines, hopefully you'll see that InnoDB is set to the default. Now, it is possible to change which engine you use, and you're probably not going to want to. For this tutorial, you're going to want to make sure that InnoDB is the default engine, unless there's something even newer and better that's come out since this tutorial, in which case you could switch to that. But in this tutorial, we're going to be using the InnoDB engine. It is possible to specify on a table-by-table basis which engine your table uses. And again, most of the time that's probably going to be pretty useless, but it's quite common that if you see a SQL script that's intended to be executed to create a complete database, after every table it will specify which engine each table is using, and it's normally going to be the same engine every time, and it's normally going to be InnoDB. So in case you see that in the script, it's kind of important to know about. If we type in here show table status, we can see which engine each of our tables is using. We've only got one table at the moment, and it's using the default InnoDB. But I could change that, and there are a number of ways I could change it. So let's create a table. Let's call it test, and I'll give it just one column. So let's say ID int, and I'm going to say next, after this bracket, I'm going to say engine equals, and pick a different engine. So the only one I've actually used is this MySQL. So let's go ahead and try that. So I've executed that, I've created the table, and now let's look at show table status. And we see that we've got a test table using this MySQL database. I'm going to delete that for the moment. Let's say drop table test, and we'll see another way of doing that. So another way you could do this is you could set the default storage engine for your session. So you could say set default, this is right, I think, set default storage engine equals MySQL. Let's try that, it looks good. And now let's do show tables. So there are the tables, just to remind ourselves, we've only got one table now called users. And I'm going to do show table status. Okay, that's good. And let's also do show engine. So we see that this one table we've got users is using InnoDB, as we saw before. Let's do show engines. Now we can see that MySQL is set to the default. So we'll try creating another table. So create table, I'll call it test again, and we'll say it's just got one column ID. And I won't specify a storage engine, so I'll execute that. And then we'll do show table status. And now we can see that the default really has been changed to MySQL, as we also saw when we did show engines. Struggling to remember because these are commands that I very infrequently use. Most of the time you don't need to bother with this, but I just want to show you this so you kind of are familiar with it and you're not puzzled if you come across it. And you do want to make sure with show engines, you do want to make sure that InnoDB is set to the default. So let's set InnoDB back to the default. Let's say set default storage engine equals InnoDB. I don't think the capital letters make a difference there, but I'll put it all in capitals because that definitely works. And then again we'll do show engines, and now we can see InnoDB is back to the default. Now let's say you've got MySQL installed and you find you're using, it's a recent version of MySQL, so it supports InnoDB, but for some crazy reason you find that it's using MySQL. You can change it in your session, as we've just seen, or you can specify it after every table that you should use InnoDB if necessary. If you're the administrator of your MySQL server yourself, you can also change this in the config file. So this is kind of taking us a little bit away from the point of this course as a whole, but I'm just going to demonstrate that quickly. So if you look in the MySQL folder, you'll find there's a MySQL.cnf if you're using Linux or some kind of Unix type system like the Mac, and it's probably going to be called .ini if you're using Windows. Now, although this is present in my MySQL installation folder here, in fact on the Mac, and you would have to check this if you want to do it for Windows, you have to check where the default location of this file actually is, because it's actually not here. This isn't the one that's actually being read on my system, which is a Mac. So let's go to a terminal now. And again, if you're not familiar with the terminal, really don't worry about it, because this is taking us off the main point of this tutorial anyway. But what I had to do was I had to go to where this file is actually located. Let's go to cd user local MySQL, which is where it happens to be located on my Mac, and it could be different for yours. And this is really just a kind of dummy configuration file. And if we look at it, it's pretty simple. It's just most of these options are just comments, or they're just commented out. But what I did do, what I've already done here, I've added this myself because at least in my version here, it didn't already exist. I've added this option, default storage engine equals my ISAM. So this is how you can configure it if you want to. So on my Mac, the actual location that this file is really read from is in /etc. And of course it's going to be different on different systems. So you have to Google this if you want to do it. So here's my my.cnf, or it will be my.ini on Windows. I'm going to do sudo via my.cnf. So I'm just using some Unix commands that I'm familiar with already, but you could edit this in any editor, as long as you have to make sure it's not read-only. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to save it. And let's first check that there isn't already a default storage engine option in there, and there isn't here. So let's add it. In fact, let's stop the server first. Let's go to System Preferences, and I'm going to stop the MySQL server. If I get the right admin password for my Mac, it will really help a lot. More haste and less speed. Okay, so I've stopped it. Now I'm going to put in here default storage engine, just like I edited the non-working demo version, but now I'm really editing the version that's actually being used. So I'm going to put my ISAM right in here in this MySQL D section. So I've saved that, and I'm going to start my server again. Let's go to System Preferences, Start MySQL Server. Then I'll go back to my MySQL Workbench, and I'm going to quit this. Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, we're going to look at a MySQL setting that affects how inserts are allowed to run when the insert is trying to insert into a table with not null values. So we're going to look at another useful setting option to know about. And in this course, we're probably going to see at least one more very useful MySQL specific setting that you should know about. So there's this setting called SQL mode. And the settings in MySQL in general can have global and local values. So let's take a look at what that actually means. To start with, I'm going to say select. And this following syntax is very, very specific to MySQL. So it's not a general SQL thing, but I'm going to type two kind of @ signs, and let's put in here global.SQL_mode. So if we take a look at the value of this, we see it's set to strict all tables. So if you want to read about what this actually does, and I will explain in just a moment, excuse me, then we can search, let's say in Google, for MySQL SQL_mode. And in the first document that's linked to here, you get the MySQL documentation page. And there you can see various ways of setting this SQL mode, and you can see the most important SQL modes and just general various things you can set it to. You can also see how to set this value in your configuration file to set it sort of permanently. So we'll take a look at what this actually does in a minute, and we'll see that it can affect how our queries run. But I also want to mention that there is also a session SQL mode. So let's take a look at that. And I appreciate that this is going to be a bit cryptic at the moment, but all will become hopefully clear shortly. So let's say 2 @ and a session.SQL mode. So we can run this select statement with multiple values as long as they're separated by commas. And if we run this, we find that my global and SQL, global and session SQL modes are actually set to different values. And that's just because I've been playing around with it a bit. So when I installed MySQL, the default for both of them was no engine substitution. Now the global version of any setting in general, that's going to set the value for any connection that's made to the server. So if someone else connected to the server, or you ran an app that also connected to the server in addition to this MySQL workbench, if you've set the global mode, that's going to affect these other connections as well. Whereas if you set the session mode, that's only going to affect this particular session. In other words, it's going to affect this connection that you've made now. And if you drop the connection in the workbench and start it again, then the session SQL mode is going to default back to the global SQL mode. So there are sessions here, but there are also global values that you can set for any connection that's made to your server. If you restart the server, you're going to lose both of these, and they're going to default either to the default values or to whatever you set in the config file. So if you want to set a variable like one of these permanently, you need to set that in the config file. So this will be SQL mode equals such and such. So what actually are these values? So the session SQL mode is the one it's actually going to affect this session, and I've got it set to no engine substitution, which was the default when I ran MySQL. Now, according to the documentation, what this value actually does, no engine substitution, is that if you specify when you create a table, if you specify an engine, as we saw in the last tutorial, but you misspell the engine or something, or you specify an engine that's not available, then if this variable is not set, MySQL is going to just substitute some available engine, whatever the default engine is set to, for that misspelled unavailable engine. If this is set, it's not going to do that. So if you specify an engine that doesn't exist, then it's not going to substitute it with some default value. So if we do, for example, create, let's get rid of this and say create table test1 id int engine equals some gobbledygook. If no engine substitution is set, then it's not going to execute that query. Now what we're really interested in here is setting a mode called